Well, welcome to what was meant to be the final grandstand event of this series, but it isn't. Because we've arranged for one of our little seminars, which was cancelled because of the industrial action, the Tatiana Sandon, to actually happen next week. So if you get bored of buying me Christmas presents and all your activity of preparation for the festive season, or you wish to raise up from any post-election depression for which you are afflicted, the fun continues.
Don't rub it in.
We might, whatever.
The party might only just be finishing by then.
I think they were finishing.
Yes.
We know it's fun now.
Anyhow, we have made it through the dark night of the election campaign to Rebecca's seminar, and we're very clear. Record, of course, is formally quite a long time ago now, though, of this parish. But is now and has been for quite some time in Cambridge. And when we were organising this seminar, I think she was the first person I invited, partly because I bumped into her on Beale Station, which is not my normally way in which we've recruited people to speak in seminars. But filling those free moments and saying, "What are you doing here? Would you like to give a seminar?" was again one of my small talk gestures. Rebecca would be known, I think, to most of you through her work on medicine and Roman women, but she's also produced an enormous, compendious, edited volume very recently, I think so enormous and compendious and recent that I haven't actually seen it, on reproduction through the ages. And today she's going to take us back to, I think, a more narrow field of gender and parenthood, or gender and non-parenthood in the Roman Empire.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I am going to stand behind this lectern, partly because then I can see you. The chair is really short and I'm quite short, so this is the best way to see you. And I also should give you a little bit my sort of captatioing. So having decided somewhat late in the day that I was going to go old style and not do a PowerPoint but a handout, I then discovered that I had better things to do on an election day than correct the handout. So there's a couple of typos, but the bibliography is woeful. I'm telling you that kind of now. So I think it's also the first time I've ever given a seminar on an election day. So we'll see whether you should think of that as a good omen or not. So in her magisterial study of Roman marriage, Susan Treggiari makes two significantly gendered claims about fertility in the conjugal context. So this is a context in which the production of legitimate children is understood by everyone to be absolutely fundamental to the institution. It's one of the key reasons for marriage, although not the only reason by any means. Marriage is a very complex phenomenon in a differentiated, if not diverse, world in which people are pursuing some quite particular aims in terms of the marriage alliances they make. But anyway, Treggiari, under the heading of choosing a conjunx, includes fertility on the list of qualities that were sought in a wife, but not really a husband, which then ties into a clearer statement made later in the book, which is in her discussion of married life, that, and I quote directly, if a couple failed to have children, it was usual to assume sterility in the wife. This is on page 427, and others have followed since, or indeed she's picking up on comments that previous scholars have made. Now, child production is essentially a female role. It occurs in the female body. The words woman and mother go together much more closely than man and father in ancient Rome as elsewhere. So maybe it's just not at all surprising that responsibility for reproductive failure is laid at her door, and that consideration of that responsibility enters into the business of spousal selection too. Quite apart from the fact that most of our sources provide a male perspective on these discussions, so we're much better informed about the ideal wife than the ideal husband more generally, although there are texts that have kind of, these are the 4 things that you should look for, and these are the 3 things that you should look for in both. And certainly Trejaria is not, she's aware of those border issues. Now, this assumption that failure to have children was the fault of the wife contrasts really very clearly with ancient medical and philosophical opinion that if a man and a woman having intercourse do not produce offspring, the cause is sometimes him, sometimes her, and sometimes a combination of the two, which is, to paraphrase roughly from Aristotle to Paul Begina. Moreover, evidence that fertility was actively looked for in a prospective bride, I think, is pretty slim, maybe possibly with the exception of remarriage. And that final point, I think, emphasises the sense in which the world of Roman family formation and parenting was really a much more kind of messy and complicated one, in which there were likely to be multiple births, miscarriages, stillbirths, infant mortality, divorce, adult mortality, remarriage, not to mention adoption involved, and probably, certainly all of those would have played together a much larger role than failure to conceive, full stop, or indeed first marriages. First marriages may be a very small part of this picture. And in this paper, what I want to try and do is allow some of that complexity to come through and contribute to a more rounded understanding of ancient parenting, of what divided and united women and men in their family projects in various different kinds of ways. And I'm going to do this by first of all investigating the question of interest in fertility at marriage and the distribution of responsibility for reproductive failure. Medical sources are, you'll be not surprised to hear, going to play a certain role in both of those discussions. And I'm also going to explore the claim, which is related to certainly the second half of that, that a wife's infertility was standard grounds for divorce in the Roman world, which is another claim that turns out to be much more complicated and controversial than is often presented. And then I'm going to try and bring it all together by some ways of conclusions. So Tregiari's main evidence for concern with female fertility in terms of thinking about marriages is, and this is certainly not by any means only her that quotes this, but she focuses on a passage from the Gynecology of Soranus of Ephesus, the noted physician who practiced, taught and wrote about medicine in Rome under Trajan. This is at 1A on the handout, and that comes as part of the Gynecology, which is broadly speaking a text about how to have healthy children through the vehicle of the female body, so through a kind of discussion of female physiology and how best to direct the resources of female physiology towards childbearing, to avoid and cure diseases, as well as then how to look after the child. And this passage comes immediately after a section on the age up until which females are ideally kept virgin, in which Soranus argues very strongly that while intercourse shouldn't be delayed too long, it is best to wait until the girl is at least 14, after menarche and after the complete formation of the generative parts, so that she can bear heterosexual sex, pregnancy and birth without too much risk. And then we get a section which is about how to recognise those able to conceive, which opens, as you can see, with the statement that since most women are joined in marriage on account of children and inheritance, not merely for a pleasant life, so it is utterly absurd to inquire about the excellence of their lineage and the abundance of their wealth, but to leave whether or not they are able to conceive, a way of translating sunlambenen, or have the right physical formation to give birth, or not unexamined. We should therefore give an account of the matter, which he does, arguing that general health is the best indicator rather than focusing on particular features, particularly, say, for example, the hips, which allegedly some of his predecessors had done, or arguing for tests involving suppositories or fumigations. He says they are not helpful or accurate. Basically, if you've got a fit, well-balanced woman between the ages of 15 and 40, it should all be fine. That's his message. Now, whereas Treggiari reads the Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, who is writing a few decades before Soranus, and this is at 1b on the handout, as oppositional, as demonstrating that in fact the elite sought good birth, wealth and looks in their prospective spouses, both spouses, and not the virtue that Musonius thinks is most crucial for the kind of partnership and community which marriage is all about, and which he argues is best served by a plain, healthy body that can sustain hard work and child production, paidopoia. So Treggiari reads this passage, I think entirely rightly, as oppositional, as saying this is what everybody does, I think you should do something else, but if we're thinking about what the general conventions are, we go for the wealth, birth and looks. She reads Soranus as much more normative, whereas he too, I think, is very clearly trying to change elite practice. He's particularly actually probably trying to change it about girls' age of first marriage, but also about consideration of fertility, suggesting that actually I would read that passage as suggesting that the elite don't give much attention to this. But he's also saying that it's quite a straightforward matter. You don't really have to worry too much about it. If everybody's healthy, then the rest is going to follow, and you certainly shouldn't go for any of these sort of impractical and intrusive tests. And if we go kind of beyond this, then all the evidence in which people do list the conventions, what are people looking for in spouses, and all the evidence for people actually looking for spouses, Pliny or whatever it might be, suggests that we are really looking at breeding and virtue and wealth and to some extent looks or character. The only places that we find anything different are 1c on the handout. I've given you a passage from Juvenal Satire 6, obviously a very kind of reliable guide to the matters of marriage, in which we get this kind of perfect black swan kind of woman who would be good looking, charming, rich and fertile, ancient ancestors, chaste, etc., etc. I think it kind of speaks for itself, and also Tacitus in the Annals, in which various members of the kind of Senate around Claudius are touting their candidates to replace Messalina as Claudius's next wife, and Agrippina is being described as superior in family distinction, proven fertility and the appropriate moral qualities, but this is in a situation in which she has already born, well, she has one child at this point. Whether or not she's had other children, I don't know, and her mother obviously was also pretty fertile, but this is a different context in which the sort of discussion about fertility can be had differently. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to argue that fertility is of no interest in marriage, although as a kind of wild card I've decided to give you 1e, which might suggest that it is. So this is a passage which is from Ulpian, ultimately, and which is quite different in various ways, because we've got, normally the language used is that the man takes a wife in some different sort of context, but he's always the subject. But we have, if a woman marries a eunuch, a spardo, this is a discussion about dowries. I think a distinction should be drawn as to whether or not he was castrated. So spardo is the generic term, it can cover a range of different incompletenesses. But in other discussions we have a difference between people who are born, say, with one testicle or in other ways impaired, and people who have actually been castrated. And generally the feeling is that if you've been castrated, then you're probably not going to be able to sire children. Whereas if it's a kind of natural failure, there's always a possibility that you might be able to have children. So this is kind of brought up here. If she marries a Spardo who is actually castrated, then there's no dowry because it isn't really even a marriage, whereas if he's not castrated, then there is a dowry, there is a marriage, and there is an action for a dowry. But clearly we are here, although we could say pushing it, the kind of case is that if you've got no prospect of children, is there no marriage, or is that actually because of kind of masculinity and gender in this case? But as long as there's any prospect, then we've got a marriage. But clearly this is a woman who is not marrying a Spardo for the cause of having children. That's not the main enterprise that is being undertaken here. And there are a number of different contexts in which alliances, politics, economics, inheriting the firm, all of those sorts of things are going to be the main concern in marriage negotiations. But I think very often, or at least even in those cases, you are going to think about fertility. It might be that actually, if you've already got children, that you might want there not to be that prospect. But I think in general, my difference with Tregiari here is much more to do with emphasis and explicitness. I think that Soranus's move is about attempting to draw attention to something medical, so within his realm of expertise, which is generally, he would say, had been undiscussed. He wants to draw attention to it and then actually dissolve it into general health. And you can imagine that that would already be a topic of general interest. I don't know whether people did actually sort of talk about that openly, or whether they kind of just had a sort of general interest in people being healthy in terms of first marriage and so on. But you could see that this would just all fit in. You should be interested in general health. Fertility is part of that, but it's not a kind of explicit topic. But you could also see that this is something that would actually be of interest to everybody, not just the elite, in terms of the negotiations that are going on. So I go through that really mostly as a kind of warm-up for the main argument that I want to make, which is about responsibility for reproductive failure and what that tells us about the way that parenting was gendered in the Roman Empire. Because, and I need to do this in part because Tregiari kind of makes the two arguments, but also because clearly if there was a specific focus on fertility in respect to what was sought in a spouse, and if it was very clearly gendered, then that could easily point in a particular direction about where responsibility would fall within the context of the marriage. If you've kind of done a deal which is effectively all about fertility, then, and it's all about her fertility, then if that deal doesn't come off. But if we're in a point in which we're in a kind of context in which everything is kind of vaguer, there's a sort of some interest, and there might be some interest for both the man and the woman, then we're much more in a kind of situation in which the possibilities are much more open. So in moving on, I want to start with the medical view again. Now, Soranus's chapter on non-generation, agonia, and non-conception, asphlepsia, is missing in the Greek original. The title is just preserved in an index. But we have two later Latin versions, one by Carolus Aurelianus around AD 400 probably, and one by Muschio, maybe a century later, which come down to us. And I've given you the Muschio bit because this is the most popular version. We've got lots and lots of manuscripts of it. But if you compare, you can see that Carolus and Muschio are engaged in the same project. I mean, they say that they're both Latinizing Soranus's gynecology. And if you compare where we've got the Greek and the Latin, you can kind of see their project broadly, which is that these are certainly not literal translations. These are much more adaptations, abridgments of the original text. Usually they've cut out the discursive bit at the beginning, so Soranus always starts with there is a debate about X. Some people say this, some people say that, they are all wrong, and here is my kind of right position. But Muschio and Carolus Aurelianus are not really bothered with that, so they cut straight to the chase. But broadly speaking, and occasionally they have some sort of internal references that are probably their own, but usually we're looking at something that is an abridged version of the original. And in the case of the chapter on infertility, the texts are pretty similar. So although there was likely more kind of introductory material in Soranus, the basic argument, I'm sure, is his. And the basic argument is that sterilitas is something shared by men and women. It takes many forms, all of which arise from problems either of the whole body or of the specific parts in either men or women. So that, for example, if a man has some kind of general chronic disease, it will make his seed kind of thin and watery, or he could have a malformed penis so that he can't get his seed into the right place. And similarly, if a woman is kind of weak and consumptive, then she's not going to be able to sustain the pregnancy. And if the mouth of the womb is misaligned or in some sense got lesions or growths on it, then the male seed won't be able to enter and there'll be no conception. And then, having identified where the problem is, you either treat the general problem, so you make the person healthy generally, or you try and address the specific problem in order to organise for there to be procreation. And it's quite similar also in a Greek encyclopedia of roughly the same, well, there's a little bit later, 7th century Paul of Aegina. And indeed, in general, this would be the assumption of most medical texts, although Soranus is particular in that he has he thinks that both men and women produce seed, but that the female seed doesn't contribute to offspring at all. And what's also distinctive about his chapter on sterility is that although he has both men and women contributing, he doesn't put much emphasis on the combination between the two, and that is often something that is very much stressed. Plato and Aristotle, for example, but also Lucretius and Pliny. And I've given you a little bit of Pliny's book 7, talking about human beings and the wonders of generation more broadly, at 2b on the handout, where we have various points about the combination not working, and the different ways in which the combination can or cannot work. So there's some variety in these discussions, but there's a basic consistency in relation to a equal causal distribution. So the medical view would be that absolutely men and women both can cause failure, procreative failure. Now, of course, it's perfectly possible to have an absolutely, completely consistent and clear medical message, and a logical one. After all, male seed is rather important in terms of the production of children, which, in fact, despite its consistency and its logic, makes absolutely no impact on people's behaviour or on the law or on wider ideas and attitudes at all. And we might think about the age of girls at first marriage as a case in point. The medical authors are pretty consistent that you should wait till after menarche, and that it's quite dangerous for young girls to become pregnant. But the evidence that we have shows that some Roman girls are married really, really young. So that has very little impact, as far as we can see, on people's behaviour. And these doctors do not talk from a particular position of authority. Soranus is making a bid for authority in his text. He doesn't have it. So it could be that we just got the doctors say one thing and everybody's just kind of getting on with anything else. It is his children, if you like, that are at stake here. It's his family that's going to be continued in terms of a marriage, and the Roman world's a patriarchal one, so they might just be kind of getting on with it, and blaming the women does happen. But I would say that the actual evidence for a default or active assumption that it's the wife who is sterile in a non-procreative marriage is pretty tenuous. It's largely indirect and rather complicated. So nobody actually says this kind of outright. But we could say that, well, wives are traditionally praised for their fecunditas in literature and funerary epigraphy, and we don't see the same kind of terminology used for men, although we certainly do have men praised for having lots of children, and indeed after the Augustan marriage legislation you get a political advantage from having in your kind of elite career from having quite a lot of children. And if you were to read on in the Pliny the Elder passage, then you would have the description of the fact that it's amazing that Augustus lived to see his great-great-grandchild, that Metellus Macedonicus had 27 people that called him father, and that there's this ordinary guy from, I can't remember where it is, in Italy, who went to a sacrifice on the Capitol accompanied by 8 children, 27 grandsons, 18 great-grandsons, and 8 great-granddaughters in a procession which outshone all others. So there is a sense in which men do get credit for having very large numbers of descendants. And Pliny is making a technical point about whether they are sons, daughters, the children of the sons, the grandchildren of the, but they all get to call these people pater, as it were. So, I mean, there clearly is a difference in this going on. It's about that whole line of succession. It's about patria potestas. It's about being the pater familias. It's about something legal as opposed to necessarily something physical. But we are still thinking about these issues for both in various different ways. And in general, you might say that the Roman family is a kind of, well, maybe all families are hybrid forms between a kind of legal structure and a sort of physical reality, but the Romans kind of emphasize that and make that explicit more than others do, in the sense of that the crucial thing is the establishment of patria potestas, and the kind of physical reality behind that is less important in various senses, the point that I shall come back to. So the other point that is, the other kind of issue that's raised in terms of just a piece of paper. The other argument, indirect argument that's made in terms of why we should think of the women as being considered to be at fault in all of this is that we have this rule that I'm not sure if rule is the right sense, but there's a kind of standard practice which is that men can divorce their wives for sterility, and we don't have any women that divorce their husbands for anything similar to that. And I want to look a little bit more at this because this again is, I think, a little bit more complicated than has often been allowed. Now, to a certain extent, you could say by the Roman Empire, and this is a lecture series that is definitely talking about the Roman Empire. So once we're in the world of non-manus marriage, then in order for there to be a divorce, all you really need is for one party, on a sort of technical level, is for one party to withdraw their consent, to just say, I'm not married anymore. You don't need to write a long letter explaining what your problem is or what the causation is or give any reasons or anything like that. But there are, in terms of the sort of reasons and fault and all of those kind of discussions, they're not entirely irrelevant because there are financial consequences dependent on whose fault it is. So you can get to keep the dowry or bits of the dowry if there are children or in cases of adultery and so on. And there clearly also are esteem consequences, which are maybe not so much emphasised, but it clearly is something that all of your friends, if you're a member of the elite, certainly, and I suspect all of your friends, even if you weren't a member of the elite, do care about, and there's a sort of, it's not a free game. You do actually have to be able to, or at least it makes your life a lot easier if you can plug into something that is a general kind of view, attitude, that this is an acceptable form of behaviour. So in that context, then sometimes we do have reasons that are given for a divorce, and these do certainly include sterilitas. The famous case here is that of Corvilius Ruger, and he gets mentioned twice, but 1d, Valerius Maximus, writing under Tiberius, gives him the credit for having the first divorce at all. and also that it was on account of sterility. And we are also told that this didn't go down too well, that this was thought to be a tolerable reason, but he was pretty much criticised because his kind of colleagues did not consider that even desire for children should be placed ahead of conjugal loyalty. So that's the story that we're told by Valerius Maximus. The case of Carvilius Rugo is a famous one, and we have various other versions of it. That's a kind of compact version. If you want a more expanded version, then I've given it a little bit of it to you under 1C, which is Aulus Gellius talking about the case. And he gives a story which is that Carvilius Rugo did not want to divorce his wife. He was actually very attached to her, but felt he had to because of the oath he was obliged to swear as part of the census proceedings, and in particular to the censors, where he had to swear that he was married for the sake of getting children, and that he's presenting it that he felt that oath kind of, and his public duties trumped his obligations to his wife. And you might think this all sounds a bit odd in terms of the story that Aulus Gellius tells us, what is going on, and that it doesn't quite sit exactly with the story that we're getting from Valerius Maximus, and that it's clearly not true that there were no divorces in Rome until 231 BC. We actually hear of a couple of others, and there's probably reference in the 12 tables and so on. So the idea is that how we should interpret this, and this is first put forward by Alan Watson in the famous article that I put on the handout, but has been followed by pretty much everybody since, is that we shouldn't think of the Carvilius Rugo case as the first divorce, but it's the first one in which there was a particular financial dispute, or a financial dispute of some sort altogether, because up until then there had been some kind of set of regulations, may or may not have been put in place by Romulus, which kind of specified a set of reasons for which you could divorce, and if you did it for any other kind of reason, then you paid a very heavy financial penalty. Your wife got half the estate, and the Temple of Ceres got the other half, according to Plutarch and the Life of Romulus. Take it or leave it on that, but it does seem that there was some kind of set of accepted reasons for divorcing your wife: adultery, poisoning your children, and kind of running off with the keys to the household coffers, the sort of some sort of destruction of the family resources. And if you divorced a wife in other contexts, then you would have some kind of penalty. So we don't have to kind of go with that whole story, but you can see that it would make sense then that if the situation is that either Rugo wants to divorce his wife for sterility just straightforwardly, or because of this whole business with the census, which is a little odd that it's only just come up now, you can see that there's a sense in which he wants to do that without paying a penalty, and this is therefore about a negotiation in terms of the finances of it. So presumably the family, at least her father, tried to get the dowry back. He said, but I didn't want to divorce her, I had to because of the oath. The suggestion certainly is, in the way that the stories are told, that he didn't have to give up the dowry. But anyway, I mean, I think from my point of view, it doesn't particularly matter about the exact details, although, interestingly, in the sort of Valerius Maximus version, where we have nothing to do with the oath and the censors, it is simply for sterility, and then his friends weren't very keen. You could say that in the Aulus Gellius version, that's not the issue. The issue is to do with the oath around the census itself. But I suppose we should think about this sort of situation, as it were, as something which does happen, but which is, or something which is thought about kind of problematically, and that comes very much to the fore in another set of evidence that is used or is brought into this discussion, which is from some of the Latin declamations that survive from the imperial period. So these are these kind of pretend legal battles where either Roman school children, sort of school teenagers, or the most illustrious orators of the day, in the case of the Seneca the Elder's Controversiae, get to kind of play out a fictitious legal case. And the kind of point very often of these is that they set up a scenario in which there is a kind of important conflict at the heart of it, which is that there's a rule of some sort, and this is a difficult case in which equity suggests that maybe the rule shouldn't be quite applied, that there's an argument which is something like, the rule is this, and therefore you should apply the rule, but there's always a kind of counter-argument, which is it's not fair in some sense. And then you can have a kind of interesting moral ethical discussion played out in a kind of forensic setup. And we have a couple of cases here which are about divorce or sterility. And the shorter one, which is the pseudo-quintillion, the lesser declamations, which is probably later, maybe 3rd, maybe even 4th century AD version. Because they're more compressed, they give this very kind of formulaic version where they say, this is the kind of law, and then this is the problem. And the law is here that it's permitted to divorce a wife who's not given birth, depending exactly how you want to translate parientem, within 5 years. So the law is that. But we also then have, in the case of the pseudo-quintillion, you have a special action for an unjust divorce, a sort of contestation, divorce contestation. And then the sort of same situation is set out in a slightly less explicitly, as it were, in the Seneca the Elder, which is a much fuller discussion and has lots and lots of different speeches reported, different points made, and so on. But they all hinge on this point where they state that there's basically some kind of rule, after 5 years you can divorce, and then the question is, but should you? And in particular, she is able to bring some kind of action against that, and then you have a debate about what's right in terms of the discussion. And obviously, since mostly declamations are all about pirates and kidnapping and all that kind of stuff, you don't just want to have really boring people who decide to divorce each other. You've got to sort of make it all a bit more interesting. And in particular, the way that it's made more interesting is by giving the wife some kind of having gone over and above the duties of being a wife, as it were, and therefore the kind of question of fairness arising much more clearly. So in the Seneca the Elder case, I've just given you the little kind of blurb for this, where we have a wife tortured by a tyrant to find out if she knew anything about her husband's plot to kill the tyrant, persisted in saying she did not. Later her husband killed the tyrant. He then divorced her on grounds of sterility. When she bore no child within 5 years, she brings an action for ingratitude. So, I mean, you can see her point really in all of this. And then the kind of the speeches reported take on a number of different themes, both for and against, the law, the fairness of the situation, and there are a kind of series of questions which are, for example, is she really barren? Has the torture made her barren? In which case, should we think about this a little bit differently? But again and again, they come back to the point, is it right to divorce a wife if she has been, in all other respects, apart from bearing children, a loyal, a good, an ideal wife? And in the case of this, has even borne torture for you. And there is a further kind of theme that runs through the Seneca one, which is about the trope, the kind of Roman trope that what you do, one of the things that you do, or one of the things that you don't do under a tyranny is have children. It's a kind of automatic, or it's an important response to tyranny that you do not have children, you don't bear children under a tyranny, and that one of the reasons that to show that you're not a tyrant and that you're in fact auguring a kind of more beneficent kind of world is that lots of people will have children and there will be lots of little baby Romans kind of frolicking around the place. So that's also a theme of this. But again, in the Quintilian, although it's kind of much more brutal in various ways, there is a sense in which clearly he owes her more than just from being how you should behave in terms of the wife, so that we have this kind of debate in a particular sort of context. And you can see that there's been a bit of, as with all of these declamations, there was a time when they were taken rather literally, so if it said there is a law X, then we would think there is a law X. Probably not about the tyrants and about the pirates and so on, but so now people are thinking that this probably not a law, probably not even a Greek law, but is something that kind of makes sense in this context, just as the kind of her action for ingratitude it's a bit like the action for a ungrateful will, but it's not, we don't, and there's certainly no action, well, nobody suggested that there's an action in the kind of Praetor's edict which is called for unjust divorce. But these are ones that are using kind of Roman legal concepts to get at a particular ethical debate. So certainly I would see this as a topic. I'm sure there was no law to say after 5 years you can divorce your wife, but this is a topic that makes sense, I think, within a kind of Roman context. And it makes sense, I think, in particular in a Roman context in which it's not about the law, but about esteem and the view of your peers, and about kind of justice and equity and obligation and benefits and all of the kind of set of social obligations that are very much in play in the Roman context. And if we turn then, so a lot is made, as I say, of this evidence, and if we turn also to a couple of reported cases, so we do have some some other figures who are reported to have divorced their wife on account of barrenness. And I guess in a sense they continue to show that it's a rather dodgy thing to do. So the first person who is reported to do this, apart from Carvillus Ruga, is Sulla. So this is in the 1G Plutarch, the life of Sulla. And it comes in the sort of whole section on Sulla's marriages, which in general are not his finest hour or not his best kind of feature. So there's a whole kind of sequence of sort of problems with marriages, and we have thirdly Cloelia, whom he divorced for barrenness, and we're told that he did it nicely and he said nice things to her, and gave her presents, but since he married Metella only a few days afterwards, he was thought to have accused Cloelia unfairly. So again we have this, it's part of a sequence of bad marriage practices, and people the kind of response, the response was critical, very clearly. And then the other case, another person whose marriages, well, just his problems all over, but certainly his marriages weren't, is Caligula. And we have a sequence of marriages. So he now divorced, we're told by Dio, divorced Paulina on the pretext that she was infertile, but really because he was bored. And he married Milonia Caesonia, who had previously been his mistress. Since she was pregnant, he desired to make her his wife so that she could bear him a 1-month child, a 30-day child. So there's a whole discussion about the 8-month child and the 7-month child and the 9-month child, and clearly the idea is that Caligula, being a god, can have a 1-month child, just needs a kind of 1 month to make it perfect. But the people of Rome were very disturbed at this behaviour. And indeed, Suetonius, doesn't mention the reasons for any of the divorces, but has this nice line about, in terms of the marriage, it's difficult to decide whether he behaved most worst when he picked his when he married people, when he divorced them, or during the marriage. So this isn't, I think, a kind of good advertisement for the sort of general social acceptability and conventionality of divorcing wives for sterility. And then the final case, I guess, is maybe the most famous case of non-divorce for sterility, which comes from the so-called Laudatio Turiae, which is stretching our temporal period a bit, but I guess she could have known Livia. But also I just couldn't not talk about it. And there's a lot in this about on the whole theme, and I've just given you one part of it because I think it's quite interesting in terms of the phraseology that is used. So this is obviously the husband speaking, and he's recording what he says his wife did, said, her approach and attitude. So he says, "You were despairing of your fertility, fecunditas, and you were grieved over my childlessness, orbitas, and so that I would not, by keeping you in marriage, have to put aside all hope of having children and be distressed for that reason, you mentioned the word divorce." So in this case, although we have a very interesting, I think the kind of fecunditas, orbitas kind of pairing is very interesting. We have her, we are told, kind of raising the issue, but the issue she is raising is that if you stay married to me, you are not going to have children. So it's not that she is suggesting, it's not that she's divorcing him, or that's not what the way it's set up. On the other hand, she then has this kind of, well, the way that it's told, this really quite intricate plan about what's going to happen, which is that she is going to, because they're such a perfect pairing, she's going to find a new wife for him who's going to be worthy and suitable. She is not going to separate their property. He can keep all the property, and she is going to dedicate herself to kind of looking after, well, it doesn't quite say that, but the children are going to be still kind of in some sense belong to both parties of the previous marriage, and she is going to be like a sister or an aunt or a... It's all a bit weird, I have to say. People haven't said quite how strange the suggestion is and then he of course, so she's got this plan that she's going to sort of stay in the house, but there will be some other woman who has children, and then they're all going to have a sort of commune. But that he says, no, I'm shocked and horrified, how would you think that? And he comes up with the same phrase that is in the Valerius Maximus passage about Carvilius Ruga, which is that, how would you think that my desire for a child would overcome my marriage to a kind of ideal wife, as it were, but it's not. And people have actually thought about those kind of two phrases, and then obviously we go through the rest of it, and there's various other things kind of going on, and she is also somebody who has gone above and beyond. She has fought his case with the tyrants, and so there are kind of resonances with that, and where the money comes from is also unclear in terms of what would happen. But as we go through, we find that there are going to be no children, and it looks like he hasn't even adopted at the end, which is quite interesting, although maybe he's going to, now that he's buried her. And in all sorts of ways, obviously, I suspect that this isn't representative of what everybody was kind of thinking and the kind of interesting domestic setups that they were prepared to enter into. But I do suspect that this is kind of more representative of a rather messier and more negotiated reality, in which I'm absolutely sure that some spouses separated for lack of offspring. I suspect they mostly did that in order to remarry and try with somebody else, which is, broadly speaking, what Lucretius suggests very strongly. He kind of seems to think that you should have a sort of, I don't know whether he'd even wait 5 years, but you just keep trying. and eventually it will all kind of work out, both men and women. You just kind of keep swapping partners and eventually it will all work out. But I can certainly, and in a sense that's what Pliny is also suggesting, in that different couples have different kind of. And I think that would be, in a world, you'd probably, in that context, give the dowry back. It would be, or everybody would go away with their property, and I suspect that is something that would be negotiated and would be thought of as fine within the kind of whatever social circles it was. What I think comes across as more problematic in our sources is the idea of a very kind of one-sided rejection by the man of an otherwise blameless wife on account of infertility. That's the sense I get from the text, and we're also, in a sense, in a world in which that is a kind of one-sided abuse of power, as exemplified by somebody like Sulla and Caligula, that's part of what's going on. But we get a slightly modified version of that in terms of the responses to Ruger and in the declamations, which is that in general this is not something that has the social approval that most elite kind of the families, men in the elite classes, probably women as well, would not think that a one-sided, unnegotiated divorce of a woman on account of sterility, if she had otherwise behaved in an exemplary fashion, was an acceptable thing to do. You clearly could do it, but all your friends would not come to your parties anymore, or whatever. You'd be criticised, and I guess also you would have to give back the dowry. I can't see that there would be any other possibility in that case. And for example, Angela Hugg, in her PhD dissertation, argues this quite strongly, that divorce on account of sterility is not really a possibility. But to come back to the sort of general point, which I was kind of thinking about, the different ways in which parenting is gendered, or the different meanings that parenting has for men and women in all of this. I think I'm not trying to say that it isn't the wife's job to give her husband children, to give him healthy children. I think there is a sense of a division of labour that's like that. But that is a different thing from saying that the assumption is that she's sterile. It's a much more kind of pragmatic, a much more structural approach to say that this is what we're trying to achieve, and it is his children, but it's not saying that it's about kind of responsibility or fault. And actually, interestingly, Josiah Osgood, in his discussion of Turia, has a slightly different, a more flexible approach to the divorce and all this. It's kind of saying that, okay, so we entered into a bargain in which we were both interested in fertility. It hasn't worked out. We might well separate and keep trying. And it is his children that are at stake, and in a sense it's her body that is playing a particularly emblematic part of this. But the way that we conceive of that is in a much more kind of legalistic, pragmatic way than in terms of saying the assumption is that she is sterile. And I would also say that this kind of fits into a kind of general modelling. I'm not quite sure if that's quite the right word. But if we think about the Roman family more broadly, then as I said, it is this kind of physical legal hybrid, which all, in a certain sense, all kind of families which are about marriage and defining the status of children are, because it's about giving them a particular status. And as I said, there is a sense in which there is a kind of deal which puts the sort of physical work on her and gives him a kind of credit's not quite the right word, but benefit, the legal benefit or the legal structure are mostly about him in all of this. But in a way, I guess, and this was one of the things that I was thinking about at the beginning, was that we sort of have we have to come to grips with that kind of division in terms of thinking about parenting more broadly in all this, because sometimes it's said, for example, or we hear that, we have to think about the ways in which it is essentially the legal relationship with the father that is absolutely crucial. It is patria potestas that is really crucial in all of this, and that because of the ways that adoption work and because of all sorts of other things, the kind of physical underpinnings of that are left less clear than they might be. But there's also a sense in which you can say that if you were to ask the question, is motherhood more important to women than fatherhood is to men in the Roman world? Then on the one hand we might want to say, yeah, motherhood's really important. Women in the Roman world are nothing without being mothers. That's what they're puts on their tomb. But you would actually have to say, really, fatherhood is very important to Roman men as well, succession, but it's to be thought of in a rather different kind of legal framework. But we have to find a way of putting those two together to make the family work, and one that doesn't slip into using the kind of modern concepts too easily, rather than trying to get to grips with that hybridity. Thank you.
Thank you.